And in other news, negotiations are ongoing at the president's house over the proposed legal reform as both sides are trying to reach a broad consensus. Meanwhile, the deadline for the appointments to the Judges Selection Committee is looming and is causing renewed friction. As such, ILTV sat down with Professor Aumann, Nobel Prize laureate in economic sciences, for his theory of repeated games, which enhances understanding of the prerequisites of cooperation. He talked about the reform, its direct on democracy, and its effect on the economy. Let's take a look.
So the judicial reform, once again in the headlines, not that it ever really left. And you've been one of the few Israeli academics to come out in support of the reform. Why is that?
Well, the judicial reform is really long overdue. And it is a counter-reform. There was a reform, or not to say a revolution, 30 years ago when the Justice Aaron Barak became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he instituted a series of changes which made the Supreme Court and in fact the entire judicial system entirely sovereign. It became the ultimate decision-making authority in the Israeli governmental system. But due to the, one might say, revolution of Barak in the early 90s, about 30 years ago, there are no checks and balances on the judicial branch at all. The judicial branch can overrule and does overrule the legislative and executive positions. Actually, in Israel, legislative and executive are fairly close to each other. The executive is determined by a majority of parliament, but the judicial is king, okay? It's actually a monarchy. The current government was democratically elected by a majority of the Israeli people, and what is actually happening is that the judicial branch represents a minority. So this is long overdue, and I don't know why it didn't happen before, but that's the right question to ask.
There is a consensus in Israel, a pretty wide consensus, that a reform really is overdue. But many of the protesters and the people who are opposing the reform are saying that it's been taken to the extreme. Are there any aspects of the legal reform that you think maybe are a little bit too extreme as it's presented today?
I think the only aspect where I would say I disagree with it is the aspect that says that a majority of parliament can overrule the Supreme Court you know, by a vote of 61 to 59. I think, well, let me explain. This starts off with the Supreme Court being able to declare a law passed by the Knesset as, how does one say, pasul, is allowed to negate a law, say that this law is not a law, okay? Mm-hmm. Actually vote to overrule the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court is overruled. And this I disagree with. I think that this should, I think the Supreme Court should have checks and balances on the legislative branch. They should be allowed to say this is not a good law, or this is against the basic laws, or yes, unconstitutional, one might say. We don't have a constitution, but the equivalent of unconstitutional. They should be allowed to say that, but one should require either a much larger vote of parliament, or else one, and I think this is preferable, I think we should have a situation where a a special majority of the Supreme Court provides this. The situation now is that 3 justices out of the 15 of the Supreme Court, and they are appointed by the President of the Supreme Court, so she can appoint people who think like her, okay? And 3 members of Parliament can, 3 justices of the Supreme Court can, by a vote of 2 to 1, overrule an act of Parliament. That is ridiculous, okay? I think one should have a much the full, to overrule an act of Parliament, there should be all 15 justices should sit, and there should be a special majority, like maybe 12 out of the 15 or something like that, should say this is clearly something unconstitutional, okay? Now that is but the Supreme Court should be allowed to overrule an act of a Parliament. That, I think, is something where the reform should be adjusted. But as it is now, there are no checks and balances at all on the Supreme Court. Yes, the Supreme Court can do what it likes. Yes, so it's not only the Supreme Court, by the way, it's the whole judicial system of Israel.
We're seeing protests here in Israel against the reform. And one of the main criticisms as well is that it will have an adverse effect on the economy. You are, of course, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. What is your take on this? Do you think that the legal reform will, in fact, have an adverse effect on the economy?
I don't see why the reform should have an adverse effect on the Israeli economy, except if people say it will have an adverse effect on the Israeli economy. Then it might have one, yes. President Roosevelt, back in the Great Depression of the 1930s, well, it's almost 100 years ago, okay, said one of his famous sayings is, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Okay, that's one of his famous sayings. And that is because economics, the economy, business, is very much affected by how people think that the economy will progress. If people think that it will progress poorly, then it has a good chance of progressing poorly, because people hold back on investments. They don't buy stock. They sell stock short, okay? And business goes down because there's no money to feed it, because people expect the economy to go down, and the reason that people expect the economy to go down is that people who are responsible say that the economy will go down. That's what's happening here. There was a letter of many Israeli economists saying that this will affect the economy adversely, and that letter will affect the economy adversely, not the judicial reform, okay, but that letter.
Professor Aumann, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Okay, my pleasure.